This morning on The Real Story, we're talking about the housing crisis in Connecticut and nationwide. As homelessness increases 2 years in a row, we're talking to an activist who's watched as their tents and makeshift communities have been torn down and then welcomed them into his own backyard. How an upcoming Supreme Court decision could change everything and how local solutions could make more of an impact. But first, the House Majority Leader is zooming in post-session to talk all things policy, what's passed, what hasn't, and what could change in the future. We're getting insight into those Capitol conversations and the struggle and hesitation surrounding state versus local control on this special episode, All Things Housing, this morning on The Real Story. Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on The Real Story. I'm Emma Wulfhorst. Connecticut is facing a housing crisis, and really the whole country is. But every session, people wonder what Connecticut will do to get more accessible and affordable housing options. There's a lack of housing, much of it, and a lot of it slips out of state hands into local zoning policy. While the legislature certainly can get involved through mandates and incentives for building permits, the question is, will they now, and how bad will the supply and demand get before it gets better? We've had a chance to talk to housing activists like Cara Capone, CEO of Connecticut Housing Advocates, before this past session started. Take a listen.
Connecticut is unique. It's only one of 2 states that does not have any form of county government. So that then leads to 169 different towns and cities with 169 planning and zoning commissions or boards with 169 different versions of what they would like to see happen in their town.
With a clear statewide problem, many advocates say the state needs to be more involved.
Connecticut is the second most segregated state racially and also economically in the United States. We need to do something about this. And so it's really going to be up to the legislators this session to come up with good, viable solutions so that every town is doing their fair share.
A lot of different individual, minutia and intersectional issues under the housing umbrella. Right. But as we start this new session, even though it's a short session, is there any main thing you want lawmakers to know or keep in mind as they head back to do this work this year?
A focus on infrastructure, on funding infrastructure for smaller towns makes a difference. I also feel like looking at policy that respects what makes a town unique and feels small, but also the ability to build housing within that setting. The last big affordable housing statute, decades old 830G, hasn't made the impact many hoped it would. It required towns and cities have 30% of their housing be affordable. Some residents push back, while many towns still haven't met that goal. And a lot of towns felt like they were getting affordable housing just kind of shoved down their throats. While lawmakers look for potential solutions to balance state enforcement or incentive with local zoning policy, advocates are reminding them it's not just a housing crisis. It's a deadly situation for the increasing unhoused population. What we're seeing is increases in homelessness, specifically in 2 different populations. People 55 and older with disabilities. It's just an affordability issue. They are getting priced out of their housing. They're getting priced out of their apartments. We're seeing them come into our food pantries looking for food to make ends meet so they could pay their rent and they don't have to pay for food, right? And so we're seeing increases in that population who are looking for services. The other population, and I like to call this the hidden homeless population, are families. Families with children who are preschool age, so 6 and under. They're struggling, right? They cannot afford housing. It's hard if you're a single mom and you have a child who's not school age to find appropriate and affordable childcare and transportation. And then to try and find housing on top of that. We're seeing huge increases in the number of families that we're seeing who are living in cars, who are living in someone's garage, on a 3-season porch.
And that was our pre-session conversation. Now, post-session, joining me is State Representative Jason Rojas, House Majority Leader, and most other lawmakers tell us the go-to guy at the Capitol for all things housing. Thank you so much for coming on today, Representative.
No, thanks for having me on, Emma.
So before we get into some of the details here, I really don't think there's a lawmaker who we've spoken with who doesn't call housing a crisis right now in Connecticut. Can you share with me on a more personal level how you see this impacting residents, your constituents? What kind of public comments or conversations have stuck with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most concerning story of the housing conversation is really the homelessness situation and the sharp spike that we've seen over the last year and the number of individuals who are unhoused. But it also is the kind of thing that impacts everybody, regardless of where you are on the income spectrum. Because if you're spending too much money on housing, it makes it really difficult for you to afford other things like food, like healthcare, or God forbid, even taking your family on vacation. And I think when you're housing secure, you take for granted that you're housing secure, but you don't really realize how much of your disposable income or your income in general it's taking up. That doesn't really allow you to do a lot of other things. And that has implications for employers who are looking to bring people here and hire people here. We have Electric Boat looking to hire thousands of people. Where are they going to put those people? Where are those people going to live?
Right.
So the housing policy question is really a spectrum of issues. I think the ones that get the most attention are obviously homelessness for lots of reasons, but it's far more significant than that, too.
So getting into that housing policy and legislative action now, we know we've been getting these large housing bills and proposals. Last year, there were tenants' rights and other things salvaged out of the big omnibus housing bill, but for the most part, it really was gutted. This year, we saw another uphill battle for tenants and housing development in general. The big pushback really seems to be hesitation around state versus local control. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that is the issue, right? It's a huge political problem. We have a strong preference here in Connecticut for things being done at the local level. I actually support that to an extent. I think that we can't allow it to go so deeply that it causes other sorts of problems. And I think the state has a role to play in certainly working in partnership with towns and cities. But at the same time, that's what we've been doing for a very long time. And the resulting outcome is this housing crisis that we have right now, where there are simply just no homes for sale. There are very few apartments for rent. And looking at supply and demand, when you have something that's lacking in supply, that drives up the cost of everything. And it's really making it difficult for families of all kinds to actually be secure in their housing situation. And that's why, there's this carrot and stick approach that we're forced to take for political reasons. But that's at the detriment of the entire state. And I think we need to do a bit more to ensure to make towns do what they already are legally obligated to do, but refuse to do.
And so with that, we saw with 830G, the affordable housing expectations for towns and cities. It hasn't really been enforced. That was the mandate standards route, but we've seen a shift in communities toward incentives for housing development. Like you said, really the carrot and the stick approach. Talk to me a little bit about that move here.
Yeah, I mean, 8-30G is not a proactive housing strategy. It's really a backstop, right? 8-30G is there when communities haven't done something. And when communities haven't met the goals under 8-30G, which is to allow more housing development to happen, a developer can come in, use that statute to go around planning and zoning obstacles and go to a court to get their particular proposal approved. I would prefer that not happen. But what are we supposed to do when towns and cities continue to put up all of these obstacles, either through their current zoning regulations or through the process itself, in which they force developers to come back over and over and over again to get approval at the local level, which obviously costs a lot of money. And that cost actually it results in an increased cost of housing as well, too, because the developers are going to have to make up that cost. And they make up that cost in the form of either higher valued homes where you have to get a bigger mortgage or higher rents. And at the end of the day, the average taxpayer is losing out in that situation.
Right. And you were part of the House's amendment process and debates over the housing omnibus bill. We saw an amendment specifically which could offer places like New Canaan a reprieve from 830G expectations. Again, we don't really have county government here in Connecticut. Right. You all really start having to get into these individual community conversations and the nitty-gritty here, right?
Yeah, and that particular provision was really unique to New Canaan. That was a situation in which they had earned points towards a moratorium from 8-30G, but weren't allowed to use them. So we accepted that amendment so that could address that particular issue. So that was very specific to New Canaan. But what we did include in the bills were a number of other incentive type opportunities for communities to kind of do what they're supposed to do at the local level and help us achieve this goal of developing more housing.
Right. And one of the big policy buzz phrases we hear a lot when it comes to building and zoning is transit oriented. It's no secret Connecticut is really not set up well for public transportation. There have been improvements on local and state levels, but it's still really a struggle. Talk to us about the conversation surrounding work, live, ride and why it's been such a supported solution.
Yeah, I mean, it's what a lot of other states and a lot of other countries are doing, right? Is putting housing next to existing transportation infrastructure. And, you know, it's not as robust as a New York or Boston, but we do have Metro North.
Right.
We do have the Hartford line that is coming up through the Connecticut River Valley. We do have bus rapid transit from New Britain into Hartford. And what we're seeing already is housing getting built along those transportation nodes. And what the Work, Live, Ride bill was looking to do was to incentivize that even more, so that we could see more housing development in the areas where we need it most, and that's particularly along the Fairfield County in the Gold Coast, where housing is even the most expensive. They really need those more opportunities. I mean, Fairfield County is an economic engine of the state. Its proximity to New York makes it even more attractive, and there's a lot of people who want to live there, but it's really difficult to live there when you're paying so much money just to rent an apartment or to buy a home, even if you can find either of those.
Right.
And that's just not quite possible. And we couldn't even get that bill done, right? So I think there was a lot of hypocrisy on the part of Republicans in the legislature who didn't support that bill or who were going to filibuster in the Senate. That was an incentive-based approach, which is something they always talk about and something the towns always talk about. And even then, they chose to go the political route rather than the policy route to address this critical issue.
And something else we saw that was really a story of this past session that also didn't make much ground were tenants and tenants' rights. A lot of advocates spent as much time at the Capitol as you did, really pushing for what they say were more rights, more eviction protections. What we saw from this past session and last year's session, you know, are you hoping to see that make more of an impact maybe next year? Yeah,
I think you're referring to the Just Cause legislation, right?
Yes.
Which would have given tenants protections that a landlord would have to give them a reason why they're not going to renew their lease at the end of a year or at the end of the lease period. This is something they already do for segments of the population, for individuals who are older than 62 or individuals who have a disability. They already have that protection. So the argument was, you know, if you're already doing it for some group of people, why can't you do it for everyone?
Right.
At the same time, what I heard from a lot of my colleagues is that landlords have had a real struggle over the last 4 to 5 years. You know, the eviction moratorium during the pandemic really made it difficult for a lot of landlords. And I think when you hear landlord, most people perceive these large apartment owners who own hundreds or thousands of units. The average landlord probably owns 3 or 4 units or 6 units. They're a small family business. So when we put these kind of restrictions in place, it places a real burden on them. And what I heard from a lot of colleagues was, yeah, we want to do this. There was obviously concerns from landlords about the Just Cause provision. And I think people just wanted to take a break this year and hopefully bring it back next year and have additional time to engage with the landlords over the off session to try to work through some of the concerns that they have.
As you said, we saw it's really this balance because we've heard from tenants and advocates that there are these large companies, many of which have landlords who live out of state, who are unreliable and unresponsive. But as you said, we also saw people testify at the committee meetings during the session about the Just Cause eviction bill who are small landlords, family owned, who, like you said, only have a couple buildings. Do you think that this will be enough time in this off session, as you said, to bring it back up next year for lawmakers to engage with, you know, both sides, with tenants and with landlords?
Yeah, I think time always helps. I don't know that the fundamental issues at play will change by next year, but I do find that the more conversations you can have with proponents and opponents of a bill, the more likely you are to come to some kind of compromise. I mean, I think one of the bigger concerns out there are these large institutional investors and private equity firms that are now buying up apartment buildings and even single-family homes in many of our communities. I think that's far more of a threat to our housing economy than lots of other things. And that's something I think we'll have to pay attention to as we look to the next legislative session as well.
And we've said throughout this conversation there are a lot of different communities at play here, and it's really a policy cycle, whether you're talking about affordability, jobs, childcare, and now even senior supports. We know Connecticut has an aging population like the rest of the country. The House really taking this on as a priority this session. We've talked about, how celebrated 5001 bill's passage was. This included improvements for elderly care centers too. But the main message, once again, was the state's really intentional shift toward aging in place when at all possible. But, there's this lack of available housing, obviously. Is there some consequence and concern if more people are living longer and keeping their homes instead of putting them back out on the market?
No, it's an absolute challenge that we face. There are a lot of individuals at the older age of the spectrum who would like to downsize. There's no apartments to go to. There's no condos to go to.
Right.
And that, of course, backs up the pipeline, right? That is a home in which a family can't move into and raise their family in. So it does become a vicious cycle. And as that population ages and they have greater accessibility issues or mobility issues, they're going to need the type of housing that actually meets them where they are in their life. And having a house where your bedroom or bathroom might be on the second floor will pose a real challenge for those individuals, which is even more reason why we need to build more multifamily housing and higher density housing that allows us to bring down the cost, but also meet that need for individuals across the spectrum of needs.
Definitely a lot more to get into next session. Representative Rojas, thank you so much. As always, we really appreciate you taking the time.
No, thank you for having me. I appreciate you placing a spotlight on this issue.
Of course, housing, a very big issue, and there's still more to come on that here on The Real Story. We're talking more about housing, specifically the large population of Connecticut residents who don't have housing. Activist Mark Colville is joining us to talk about Stop the Sweeps and what he and others want to see from local solutions to busting stereotypes. That's ahead.